Canada and Mexico are forming a united front against Donald Trump, and the American president's tariff threats may have just backfired spectacularly. While Trump wages his aggressive trade war against America's closest neighbors, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum met in Mexico City this week to coordinate their response. What happened next shows how Trump's divisive strategy is pushing his neighbors closer together instead of driving them apart.
Mexican leaders appear to have smoothed over the tensions that emerged following the election of Donald Trump when he succeeded in driving a wedge between the two countries with his tariff plans, causing some Canadian politicians to suggest that Mexico should be cut out of the CUSMA trade deal. These are two countries that face a common threat, and they seem to have decided they're stronger facing it together.
So what exactly did these leaders agree to? And why is this meeting such a problem for Trump's trade agenda? To understand why this partnership matters, we need to look at how Trump's trade war has been unfolding. Since February 2025, Trump has imposed sweeping tariffs on both countries. The U.S. President Donald Trump signed orders imposing near-universal tariffs on goods from the two countries entering the United States. The order called for 25% tariffs on all imports from Mexico and all imports from Canada except for oil and energy, which would be taxed at 10%. But Trump didn't stop there. On February 10, 2025, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum entering the United States from all countries, including Canada and Mexico, which provide most of the U.S.'s metal imports. The justification for these tariffs has been all over the map. In November 2024, after winning the U.S. presidential election, Trump threatened 25% tariffs on all products from Canada and Mexico, which he said would remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion of our country. Trump has also used more creative justifications, including renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and even suggesting that Canada should become America's 51st state. The economic impact has been massive. In 2025, Trump's imposed and scheduled tariffs will increase federal tax revenues by $171.7 billion, or 0.56% of GDP, making the tariffs the largest tax hike since 1993. But here's where Trump's strategy starts to fall apart. Instead of dividing Canada and Mexico, his aggressive approach has pushed them together in unprecedented ways. On September 18, 2025, Carney arrived at Mexico's National Palace for what would become a historic meeting.
Thanks so much for joining us. U.S. President Donald Trump and his tariffs are likely to be a topic of conversation as Prime Minister Mark Carney meets with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico City. Carney departed Ottawa and arrived in Mexico early this afternoon. Sheinbaum has said the meetings with the Canadian Prime Minister are not meant to undermine their trade agreement with the U.S., known as CUSMA. Carney and Sheinbaum are expected to sign a strategic partnership agreement that will cover infrastructure, trade, security, and more. He'll also join discussions on how Canada and Mexico can work together to combat drug and firearm trafficking and other activities linked to organized crime. The trip comes as Ottawa looks for more trade with Mexico in response to the U.S. trade war. Both countries are also bracing for the renegotiation of the continental trade deal linking all three economies.
The details were published September 19th, a day after Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum met in Mexico City. It was the first bilateral meeting for a Canadian Prime Minister in Mexico since 2017. The symbolism was powerful. Trumpets sounded as Carney arrived Thursday at the National Palace, the seat of Mexico's government and Sheinbaum's official residence in Mexico City. But the substance was even more significant. What emerged from this meeting was a comprehensive action plan that directly challenges Trump's divide-and-conquer approach. The countries signed off on an action plan for the next 3 years with a strategy for long-term infrastructure development, including energy corridors to support bilateral trade. This wasn't just talk. Carney and Sheinbaum announced the action plan while stressing opportunities to grow bilateral trade in infrastructure, energy, and agriculture. The action plan opens a phase in which we can further strengthen our economic ties, Sheinbaum said. The timing couldn't be more strategic. Key to Carney and Sheinbaum's meeting was the United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Pact, or USMCA, which is up for review in 2026. Both leaders made it clear they're coordinating their approach to this crucial review.
We are both undertaking massive transformations of our economy. Plan Mexico, Canada strong. Our efforts will be strengthened by working together.
Mexico and Canada want to do more on two fronts. First, work together to save North America-wide free trade by coordinating strategies for next year's review of CUSMA, the trade deal that replaced the original NAFTA 5 years ago.
How do we eliminate these tariffs that we both face prior to the end of the year so that we can have a fruitful discussion on the USMCA future beginning in 2026?
The Canadian and Mexican leaders committed to coordination ahead of a high-stakes review in 2026 of their trade pact with the U.S., as President Trump's tariff threats put the accord at risk. But perhaps most importantly, they sent a clear message that Trump's attempts to play them against each other have failed. Carney pledged to move forward together without question with Mexico, while also emphasizing the value of the USMCA's three-party strength. When directly asked about the possibility of competition between their countries for separate deals with the U.S., both leaders pushed back firmly. When asked if cooperation between Canada and Mexico could falter, if one could strike a better deal with the U.S., both Carney and Sheinbaum pushed back. Canada is absolutely committed to work with both our partners, Carney responded. The economic foundation for this partnership is stronger than many realize. A lot of people don't realize that we trade more with Mexico than we do with the entire European Union, all of Europe, including the UK. It's a pretty big deal for us. Mexico is Canada's third largest trading partner after the US and China. Canadian trade and investment with Mexico are steadily growing, with nearly $56 billion in two-way merchandise trade last year. The infrastructure potential is enormous.
It's a chance for us to talk not just about the tariff dispute that's underway, but also what are we going to be able to do to deepen our bilateral relationships with each other. We've spent way too much time ignoring each other. Now it's time to do more.
President Sheinbaum said she wanted to strengthen maritime trade with Canada. Mexico is in the middle of a huge renewal of its infrastructure, including airports, seaports, and rail. But the Mexicans are concerned that Canada's ports aren't big enough to handle the volume of trade they'd like to see. Adrian, Mexican officials are even talking about becoming directly involved in the expansion of Canadian ports, perhaps even helping to build terminals dedicated to Canada-Mexico trade. Mexico is becoming a wealthier country. It's now the world's...
Sheinbaum has been openly discussing her desire for Canada to build up its infrastructure, including ports, to create trade and energy corridors, a wish that would align with Carney's push to build major projects. This includes major port expansions that could reshape North American trade flows. Manzanillo is undergoing a major expansion that will allow it to handle the equivalent of 5 million containers a year by 2030, twice the volume that moves through the ports of Montreal and Vancouver combined. But Trump's tariff strategy faces even bigger problems than just Canada-Mexico cooperation. The legal challenges are mounting, and the Supreme Court is now involved. The Trump administration on Wednesday asked the Supreme Court to weigh in on the president's authority to impose tariffs under a 1977 law, giving him certain emergency powers. The request came 5 days after a federal appeals court in Washington struck down the majority of the tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump since February in a series of executive orders. The stakes couldn't be higher for Trump. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has warned in recent days that the U.S. would have to refund around half the tariff revenue it has collected if the Supreme Court rules the president overstepped his authority, which has been the determination of a federal appeals court and the Court of International Trade. Trump himself has admitted the consequences could be devastating. If we don't win that case, our country is going to suffer so greatly, the president said on Wednesday. The legal foundation for Trump's tariffs is increasingly shaky. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit ruled on Friday that Trump overstepped his authority in invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 to declare national emergencies to justify the tariffs. The Court of Appeals reasoned that when Congress intends to delegate to the president the authority to impose tariffs, it does so explicitly either by using unequivocal terms like tariff and duty, or via an overall structure which makes clear that Congress is referring to tariffs. Meanwhile, Trump's threats are becoming increasingly desperate. Trump has suggested that the U.S. may have to unwind existing trade deals, including with the European Union, Japan, and South Korea, if the Supreme Court doesn't uphold his tariffs. This shows just how much his entire trade strategy depends on these legally questionable tariffs. The international response has been swift and coordinated. In response, then Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canada would retaliate with 25% tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars of American goods, which would expand to 155 billion Canadian dollars after 3 weeks. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said Mexico would enact tariffs and non-tariff retaliation against the United States. But beyond retaliation, both countries are building alternatives to U.S. dependence. The Canada-Mexico partnership represents a fundamental shift in North American economics. We started with the fact, both Madam President and myself, that North America is the economic envy of the world, is the most competitive economic region in the world. And part of the reason for that is the cooperation between Canada and Mexico, both of us and the United States. We complement the United States. We make them stronger. We all are stronger together, said Carney. This message directly contradicts Trump's zero-sum approach to trade. Instead of viewing trade as a competition where one country must lose for another to win, Canada and Mexico are demonstrating how cooperation creates mutual benefits. The timing of this partnership is particularly damaging to Trump's strategy. The first is to find ways to work with Mexico to preserve North America-wide free trade, or at least as much of it as can be saved from the most protectionist U.S. administration in a century. The second is to develop a bilateral trading relationship with Mexico that operates independently of the whims of the White House and can survive whatever fate lies in store for the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement when its renegotiation finally happens. What makes this partnership especially threatening to Trump is that it's not just about trade. Through this new partnership, the two leaders agreed to develop further trade and security relationships, invest in infrastructure, and work together on climate and conservation initiatives. This comprehensive approach creates deep, lasting ties that go far beyond simple commercial relationships. The security cooperation is particularly significant. In Mexico, Prime Minister Carney will meet with the President of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, to elevate and broaden the bilateral relationship with a focus on security, infrastructure, investment, energy, and trade. This creates alternative security partnerships that reduce both countries' dependence on U.S. cooperation. The energy dimension adds another layer of strategic importance. Canada and Mexico are working on energy corridors that could reshape North American energy flows. This is particularly significant given Trump's threats to use energy as a weapon in trade negotiations. Trump's reaction to this partnership reveals his growing desperation. For most of the year, the Canadian government has been relentlessly targeted by the U.S. administration. But instead of achieving his goals of dividing and conquering, Trump's aggressive approach has created the opposite effect. The broader context makes Trump's position even more precarious. I think now, after some 8 months of Trump, it's become clear that Canada is not better off without Mexico, said McDonald. Even Trump's own supporters are recognizing that his divide and conquer strategy isn't working. The economic fundamentals support the Canada-Mexico partnership over Trump's confrontational approach. Canadian companies are the largest foreign investors in Mexico's mining sector, accounting for almost 70% of foreign investment in the sector. These deep economic ties create natural incentives for cooperation that Trump's tariffs can't easily disrupt. Looking ahead, the 2026 USMCA review looms as a crucial test. The new partnership comes as USMCA is facing a review next year. Canada is expected to announce it's launching formal consultations ahead of the review within the next week, after the Trump administration kicked off its own consultations on Tuesday. But now, instead of facing divided neighbors, Trump will confront a coordinated Canada-Mexico front. The symbolism of their unity was on full display during Carney's visit. Canada and Mexico will co-host the 2026 FIFA World Cup alongside the United States from June 11th to July 19th, 2026. It will mark the biggest tournament in FIFA history. This joint hosting arrangement, which predates the current trade tensions, now takes on new significance as a symbol of Canada-Mexico cooperation. What's particularly damaging to Trump is that this partnership demonstrates there are alternatives to his approach. Canada's new government is diversifying and strengthening its trade relationships with reliable partners to create high-paying careers, grow our industries, secure new markets, and build more resilient supply chains. The message is clear: countries don't have to accept Trump's terms. They can work together to create alternatives. The expert analysis confirms that Trump's strategy has backfired. Trump looms over this visit. Mexico and Canada now share a common threat from the U.S., said Nelson Wiseman, professor emeritus at the University of Toronto. While both leaders are interested in expanding their countries' trade with each other, I think their priority is to strategize on how to deal with Trump and the coming renegotiation of the USMCA. Even more significantly, Carney and Sheinbaum now recognize that tag-teaming Trump may be more effective than competing for separate deals with Trump, although they are still angling for them. This represents a fundamental shift in how America's neighbors approach dealing with Trump. Instead of competing for his favor, they're coordinating their resistance. The broader implications extend far beyond North America. Trump's tariff strategy was supposed to demonstrate American strength and force other countries to accept unfavorable terms. Instead, it's showing how Trump's aggressive approach pushes allies together and creates alternatives to American leadership. The Canada-Mexico partnership represents something Trump never anticipated: his neighbors working together to reduce their dependence on the United States. This isn't just about trade or tariffs, it's about the fundamental question of whether Trump's confrontational approach to international relations actually works. The evidence from this week's meeting suggests it doesn't. Instead of dividing his neighbors, Trump has united them. Instead of forcing them to accept his terms, he's motivated them to create alternatives. Instead of demonstrating American strength, he's revealed American isolation. The next few months will be crucial as the legal challenges to Trump's tariffs work their way through the courts, and as Canada and Mexico implement their new partnership. But one thing is already clear: Trump's tariff threats have backfired. His strategy of dividing and conquering has instead united his neighbors against him. And as they work together to build alternatives to American economic dominance, Trump may find that his aggressive approach has achieved the opposite of what he intended. The Canada-Mexico partnership shows that there are alternatives to Trump's zero-sum approach to trade and diplomacy. And that might be the most damaging lesson of all for a president whose entire strategy depends on convincing the world that there is no alternative to accepting his terms.